So ready. Perfect.
Good morning. Good morning. How's everybody doing, especially after that beautiful music we had to listen to, which I cannot take credit for. That was all Joe, and we'll introduce her shortly. But first, I'd like to welcome everybody for our 7th annual Dr. Winston P. Caine Endowed Lecture Series. For those of you who remember Dr. Caine and had the privilege of working with him or having him as a mentor like myself, remember the inspirational role model, lifelong learner, teacher, and clinician that he was. He really role modeled what it was to be a true clinician and an academician. I think we still have a few faculty who were residents who trained with him. Dr. Caine actually joined Erlanger in 1969 and then faculty in the Department of Medicine since 1975, where he had a very long and accomplished tenure till 2012. He received many awards, led many leadership positions, but I think what I would really like to emphasize was what he really role modeled. Every morning, his morning with the residents started with school, as he called it. It was the Caine School. They got together in the morning and they went over the mix-up towards the end or some sort of assignment that he read and he made the residents read and they discussed it. That was every morning daily routine. When we had his first endowed lecture series, the residents collected different comments, so did the faculty. What really came out of those, the common themes were the interest he took in every individual resident and their families. When they were waiting for patients, he spoke to them about life. We are taught in medical school about many things, about how to take care of patients, how to take care of disease. We are never taught how to live. Dr. Caine taught us how to live, and he role modeled it. So we are very grateful to the family of Dr. Caine, his wife, Miss Priscilla Caine, and son Adam, who actually have given us this opportunity to continue this legacy, and we welcome them here today. With that, I'd like to introduce the speaker, and I always get the input of the family and two of Dr. Caine's very close colleagues, Dr. Ruffner and Dr. Cleveland, when we think of a speaker. And when I proposed Dr. Shapiro's name, there was a unanimous yes. And I think I could go on and on about her accomplishments. I'll share just a little bit, but then share what makes her truly a unique human being and a dear friend. So Dr. Shapiro is the director of the Center of Professionalism and Peer Support and a surgeon in the Department of Surgery at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Boston, and an associate professor of otolaryngology at the Harvard Medical School. She received her BA from Cornell University and her MD from the George Washington University Medical School. She did her general surgery training at the University of California and then UCLA. First in San Diego and then in UCLA. She did her otolaryngology training at Harvard, followed by a year of National Institute of Health Training Grant Fellowship. She's been a faculty member in the Department of Surgery at the Brigham and Women's since 1987. Dr. Shapiro launched the Center for Professionalism and Peer Support in 2008. Since that time, the center has supported and collaborated with multiple institutions nationally, internationally, and its aim is to enhance clinician wellness by supporting teamwork and respect and mitigating clinician burnout. She's had many, many leadership positions and continues to really vouch and promote an issue that we all know and has now been publicly claimed to have epidemic proportions even before it had all the press and publicity that we see today. She's a down-to-earth person. When I first heard of her and met her at we were together at a retreat in Fetzger for the Parker Palmer Award, and I had heard of her work. And it was quite new at that time in 2008, and I was quite intimidated. I said, she's coming from this big place in Boston, and she's a surgeon, sorry. But we were in a small group together, and just the way she was so welcoming and humble and down to earth. We've been friends since, and when I just asked her if she would come to Chattanooga, and she said, of course. So here she is. So without further ado, Joe.
Thank you. It's just an absolute honor and pleasure to be here, especially in an endowed lectureship from, supported by and for somebody who is really so special. And, it's always in that way intimidating to do that, because you really want to honor that person. And I'm so honored to be given that opportunity, so thank you. And the other thing I want to say clearly, it's so important, is that Mukta and the leadership who invited me, you are all way ahead of the curve in so many ways regarding the difficult but opportunity that we're going to talk about today. And I think sometimes at our own institutions, people don't see us because they're just so used to seeing us. And so the kind of work that, let's say, Mukta in particular is doing nationally and obviously here locally, you should know it's really, really special. So I come as a colleague interested in learning from and contributing to our learning together about something that I think is really, really important. So part of my role today is, in some ways, to make the case that we need to continue to pay very close attention to this. We cannot take our foot off the pedal on this. This is so important. So I'll hopefully make that case, and then talk about some ways into this. There's already a lot happening here. And a lot happening nationally and some internationally about this. And so what I'm going to talk about is just simply building on that, sometimes from a different angle, sometimes more of what's already happening. I don't have any relevant disclosures. So everything I do is, a team sport. I'm sure that's true of all of you, and I just want to honor the fact that so many people locally, nationally are working on this. So, I was trained as, I'm trained as a surgeon. I take care of patients who have oropharyngeal dysphagia, so if you want to send any Zenker's patients up north, I'm happy to receive them. Love my wonderful patients. And I loved my training in many ways. And one of the things I loved about it was that we were taught, it was role modeled, and we were explicitly taught that everything that happens to the patient is on our shoulders, that we were responsible for anything that happened, which I think is amazing. And you would not want to train a generation of clinicians who didn't have that sense of deep personal responsibility for the outcomes of the patients and their families. The dark side of that, though, was that we were also explicitly taught, don't trust anybody, that you literally cannot trust anybody. It's all sort of on you, which is, we know, completely not just unrealistic, but horrible to think of, practicing in a way that doesn't honor the multitude of input that we need to do the best work that we can do. And it just, it really didn't square with my lived experience and my colleagues' lived experience, which was that we clearly were functioning as a team. And then even further than that, and this was after I trained, I started to realize that, is the organization, the institution, the practice environment that we're in has a huge effect on us and the outcomes of the work we do. Now, we're not taught that. There's such a high value placed on independence that the idea that we're affected by an institution or a culture is absolutely just completely foreign to us. And yet, there's a ton of data in different realms showing that the institutions actually do have a big effect on us and the work we do. And this is a Parker Palmer quote, and Mukta and I, really have. I think those of us who've studied his work and then the offshoots of that in medicine, he's a very wise person. But I thought this really captured it. That the institutions matter, and again, it's not something we're explicitly taught, and yet it's so true. So, there's this national now awareness that our experience actually, if you think of the whole pie, if you will, of what matters for healthcare, our experience matters. Well, we never thought that, right? That wasn't part of this equation. I mean, it was a triple aim, right? But that's just one way of saying it. We never thought it mattered. We know, however, now that there's an epidemic. There really is a burnout. Now, what I'm going to talk about today, I might say specifically if the research is done on physicians solely, I'll say physicians. I will tell you that it's definitely more acute in physicians, but much of what I'm going to talk about it applies to all the members of the healthcare team. So there is an epidemic, right? And these are the top two of these three bullets are what I think now researchers are feeling are the most important and most correlated with different outcomes. So we've got an epidemic. This is one that looked just at the prevalence of it, and there's not a specialty that's free from the risk of a burnout, which is an occupational condition. It is not a mental health issue. It's an occupational hazard, if you will. And it is increasing. As you look at the blue compared to the orange, it's absolutely increasing. There was some recent data showing we may be turning the tide with all these efforts that I think many of us are working on. But that said, it is not to be ignored. This is a very, very intense problem. So why? Like, who cares, really? I mean, really, who cares if we're burnt out or not? Well, this is one dramatic reason to care. This is a suicide rate. It's not comparing the women to men, but it's comparing male physicians compared to men in the U.S., female physicians compared to women in the U.S. We are at high risk for suicide. Every single day, a physician dies by suicide in this country, and more. Every day. I mean, we should be really, really concentrating our efforts on stopping. This is just, it's so much of it's preventable, okay? I want to stop here for a second and say that anybody who says that there is an easy answer to improving well-being and or decreasing burnout isn't really thinking clearly, because this is a very complex issue. And I also want to say that what we have to do, and this is, I think physicians have trouble doing this because of our training, is we are not really trained to be in a gray area where we're kind of balancing tensions. Unlike lawyers actually are trained to look for the gray, because that's where they can make their case argument. We want to find, and as part of our training, it's a good part, the diagnosis, right? We have things we are going to eliminate from the differential, but we're looking for the answer. And I think this has stymied us from actually realizing that we're not going to fix this. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to work on balancing the tensions that we are all holding where we have values conflict. So if you ask, anybody who's a hospital or organizational leader in healthcare, what's the primary mission of your organization? What do you think they'll say? What's the most important thing? Why are we here? Patient care. Yeah, patient care. Safety, the safety and quality of care that we give. Absolutely. Now I'm going to ask you this. Just pure safety and quality. That is our top mission. Okay, now, if you were going to design my outpatient clinic, where that is the only thing you're focusing on, how many patients would you schedule me to see in a morning? If that, 2, exactly. There's no way, they're going to get amazing care. It's going to be compassionate because I'll be listening, I'll have the time, I won't be multitasking, and it's just going to be the highest quality, safest care. But we are balancing safety and quality sometimes against production pressure. Because If I just saw 2 patients, well, one thing is, okay, truly, the institution wouldn't make, it's money, and I certainly couldn't stay in practice. But even beyond that, it would affect patient care, because what about all the patients I can't see? So this idea that it's just one thing, or we know what our values are and we are always sticking to them, it's like, yes, we do, and sometimes we're trading one off for another. And so that concept that we're in value, that we have to be constantly sort of looking at where we're balancing these values, I think is really important. It's going to be important when we consider how to do work in this well-being space. So these are some of the tensions I put up there in values conflict. I'm sure you could think of many more, but again, I talked about the first one. There's societal expectations for what individual patients want versus actually, what's okay and fair. Right? And also, there's an expectation, which we'll talk about, that we're supposed to provide perfect care all the time, and we can't meet that because we're human, right? So we have to balance that. Patient preference, an individual patient might want something, but that's not actually evidence-based. So do you meet the needs of that patient versus do you consider what's really the right thing to do, looking at society as a whole and maybe even that patient as a whole? There's personal accountability when we think about errors, and there's systems accountability. It's not either or. And there's the measurement. We should be measured. We need to be held accountable. But are we measuring the right things? And are the things that we're measuring actually driving us to do things that are counter to our mission, which is providing high quality care? These are all true, right? These are all things that we're dealing with. And so when leaders make decisions about what should happen in the care setting, they may be looking at one side of the values equation and not taking account into that, well, how's that going to affect us doing the care? Just as an example. And I think that the more that we can have conversations about, okay, what's the pressure that's causing you to want to make this edict that we have to do X, Y, or Z, and how's that going to actually feel to us doing the care, and how might it affect our well-being and the well-being of our patients? So I have to say, and I love Brian and his group who put this up, I'm finding it a little bit less helpful, but let me tell you what I like about this. This was the idea of how do we get our minds around conceiving of interventions that have to do with improving well-being, because there's hundreds, literally, of what you could do. And so what they did was they made this pie graph. It's not like statistically based or anything like that, but the most important thing about this is it points out the fact that, well, let's just say that when many people first started thinking about well-being, they said, look, our problem is, as physicians in particular, we don't take, we don't eat right, we don't exercise, we're not meditating enough, we're not doing yoga, all those things. Okay, now I'm not going to make fun of any of that. Some of those things I do, not all of them. I think personal resilience matters, and I think everybody agrees with that. However, at some point, it is unfair to ask people to deep breathe through a bad system. It's not okay to do. So yes, we need to take care of ourselves. And even within the resilience realm, if you tell me I should be doing all those things, but you structure my day so that I literally don't have time to do anything but come home and sleep, then what you're telling me to do is now putting more pressure on me, and I can't even do it. So we have to think much more broadly about how does resilience fit in. Okay, resilience matters, but it's not enough. So the thing that okay, let's look at the efficiency of practice. So that's getting the most attention, I think, well-deserved, which is, again, if the practice is so efficient and you're asking me to do things that somebody else could conceivably do, and it's taking me away from doing the things that I'm really trained to do, including really listening to patients and their families, then I'm not going to have a great sense of job satisfaction and value in what I do, and it's an incredible waste of my time and training. It's just absurd. So lots of people are working on the EHR, who's doing what, what's the input into the EHR, et cetera, and that needs to be done, and a lot of very smart people are working on that, and I'm a big believer in efficiency of practice. Okay, now, I'm not going to be talking about that. That's not my area. It's my experience as a clinician, but it's not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is more in the intersection of resilience and the culture of wellness. The thing I don't like about this is culture is, I think it's not a separate thing. There's no question about it. Culture is everything. And here's what I mean by that without my typical surgical overstatement. So culture, we understand we need a radical culture change. We really do, to actually get where we want to go. Now, how many of you have ever lived in, heard of, worked at a system where there was a manual of culture? Not a code of conduct, not a mission statement, not bylaws, not policy, but a thing that says like, well, this is how we do it here at this organization or in this division or in this specialty. Or it's never written down. Culture's never written down. It just isn't. And yet, you've probably heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for lunch every day. You can have great strategic plan, fantastic, we are this and that, but if the culture doesn't support it, it won't happen. And so it's incredibly powerful, but it's not written down. So good news, right? Good news is we don't need to take a vote to change it. We actually can do this in our microcultures, things that we have control over quite locally, in ourselves, our own behavior, but also in how we decide to do things in our organizations. And it's ripe for change, which is what I love, because I'm interested in organizational change. But the first thing is, if you're going to change culture, you have to be convinced that the state we're in now is not okay. And if those suicide numbers don't convince you and that those burnout numbers don't convince you, I'm not sure what else will. This is not about people being wimps. This is about we are in a crisis because we've not taken care of ourselves. And I want to say another thing, and I think you all know this if anybody's been a patient. You do not want to be cared for by a burnt out physician or any other healthcare team members. And if you don't believe me, there's plenty of data to back this up. When you're burnt out, you make more errors. If you make a medical error, higher chance of being burnt out. When you're burnt out, you actually, patients get discharged from the hospital before they're ready. We think of patients not in a humane way. It is a bad thing to have in terms of not just what it feels like to have it, but to be a patient, to be exposed to it. Again, you can't give what you don't have. And so anybody who doesn't think we have a problem is not reading the evidence, period, because we've got tons of evidence that this is a problem. What we're of course lacking is what's the evidence of what works to deal with it. But that's not an excuse for not doing anything. And that's the title of my talk is, I think we're at the stage where we've measured the heck out of burnout. We know that we're all at risk, that it happens at different times of our careers. Sometimes you could have it at one stage in your career and then get through it and it'll occur at another stage. It's not just women. It's not just, we're all at risk, right? There's not just one specialty, okay? So we know it's a problem and we know it's affecting our patient care, right? And we also know it's incredibly costly for organizations, because burnt out clinicians, they leave practice, they decrease their practice, okay, the volume, it's costly. So if all you cared about was money, which I literally don't know anyone in healthcare that's all they care about, but if you are in a position where you are really controlling resources, this is a fantastic way to make some money if you want to change it. Because it's a hidden cost, though, but it is there, and it is draining our profession in all sorts of moral ways, but also in terms of financially. Okay, so these things are not separate. You know that, and it's not either or. It's yes and. So to define culture, this is from a colleague of Mukta's of mine, Tony Sukman. It's patterns of relating that persist and change through ongoing interaction. That's what it is. So we can change those patterns. We can do more of the good culture and less of the things that are getting in the way of our going where we want to go. There was a study that looked at organizational efforts versus the sort of personal efforts around well-being, and it showed that organizational approaches are more effective. Excellent. That works for me, since I love working at an organizational level. Okay. I put this up to say that I have had the honor of being, of working with different organizations, rural, urban, academic, private, specialty-specific, multi-specialty in different states and some different countries as well. And I am so respectful of regional differences. The fact is, I know if you say about it to me or about me, bless her heart, that is not a compliment, okay? In the South, I love regional differences. And I love cultural regional differences. That said, my experience is the culture of medicine, and this is borne out, I think, a lot by the studies that people are doing in this realm, is so similar place to place to place. It really is. Which is why I do think at some point we have to stop measuring this problem. I mean, to me it would be like saying, okay, yes, I know diabetes responds to this regimen, all the data shows that, but let's study it at Brigham and Women's Hospital, because maybe our diabetic patients are different. Actually, no, they're not really, okay? And so at some point, let's do something, right? Which we all are doing, but this is why I think we really need to just kick this up in terms of trying different things. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly about professionalism, but first I'm going to define it and then tell you why I think it matters. So it's not this, right? I defined it as that which behaviors that support trust, relational trust, trust between different members on the healthcare team, between providers and patients, between medicine and society. That's what professionalism is, okay? It's not woo-woo, okay? We know, and I mean, we really know this. Again, look at the data. I'm just putting up some things. That we have a significant amount of unprofessional behavior. And when I say significant amount, I mean, we should really have none, actually, okay? We really should. It is a safety risk. It is a safety risk. But you know what it's a risk for, too? It's actually a risk for negative consequences for those members on the healthcare team who are exposed to this. And the most dramatic example of that, I have permission to tell this story because it was told at the first ACGME conference on well-being, was Greg Feldman, who happened to have been a Harvard medical student and then went to Stanford in surgery, and then he did a fellowship in a surgical subspecialty in the Midwest. And he came sort of under the crosshairs of a real bully, an attending who bullied him. And he ended up, Greg died by suicide. Now, Greg had no history of mental health issues. His family and very close friends feel that this was a major driver for Greg's death. That's extreme, obviously, but it is not the only example of it. And again, it's reflective of how horrible it is to be in an environment where you don't feel psychologically safe and you feel that vulnerable. So again, that's the extreme, but look at all the other less extreme, although if you want to talk about patient care, people saying that they saw disruptive, unprofessional behavior interfering with patient safety. And the Joint Commission has identified this as a significant patient safety risk, unprofessional behavior, significant. We know that just being bullied is stressful, okay, acute and chronic stress, bless you. We also know another form of unprofessional behavior is harassment. And, I have to say that I felt like we didn't have that much in medicine, but then I read the data, and we do. We still have it. And it's terrible. The effect on people of sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination and bias and harassment is really, really negative. We know for teamwork that looking at just how people are respect in terms of communication and teamwork, that it's tied to positive outcomes if it's done well and negative outcomes if it isn't. We also know that some measures will help decrease burnout but might not affect well-being, and some things will improve well-being and it won't affect burnout, and that's okay. We need to be doing both. Look at this. This is an inexpensive way to think about this, which is that if this was a survey of physicians when they were asked about how they're treated by their supervising physicians, okay, their leaders essentially, and those who were treated respectfully did better, right? Better job satisfaction, decreased burnout. What if we trained and assessed and held accountable leaders for how they're treating the people they're in charge of, if you will? That would be amazing. Okay, it's not terribly expensive to do, but we have to decide that it matters, because how are we judging our leaders? Are we judging them on that? Probably not much. We're judging them on balancing the budget, which it's not, again, none of these is either or. But you can balance a budget and treat people with respect. It's not binary. We know, on the bright side, positive communication and collaboration between attendings and residents led to lower risk-adjusted morbidity of patients. Like, let's do more of this. Let's support that. And I do want to say that I know, obviously I'm presenting national data. This is not to say that you all are having more trouble or less trouble or what. It's just that this is a problem across the culture of medicine, and it has to do with how we're trained and what's role modeled. When we have people like Dr. Caine, this, of course, is this kind of culture. The positive culture will be supported. There's a science of actually measuring how teams work, and it was applied by Jody Hoffer-Gattel. It's been applied to medicine. And she's measuring these domains, looking at, let's say, a team of people with the schedulers and the practice assistants and the MAs and the physicians and the nurses, et cetera, and measuring these domains very simply in survey form, okay? And those that have higher levels of relational coordination amongst the team actually get better patient outcomes. So it's something very upstream affecting something downstream. Now, for those of us in this audience here who are my generation, I was thinking when Mukta was introducing me and she said, how long I've been there, and I think, some of you are like, oh my God, is she old? But we didn't know this. To be fair, we didn't know that professionalism, communication skills mattered. All we valued, what did we value? Yes, so it was medical knowledge, patient care, like technical and cognitive skills. That really, we did not know that those other things actually mattered. We certainly didn't know they mattered for patient outcomes. And then we had no clue that they actually mattered for our longevity of our careers and engagement in what we're doing, which also affects patient outcomes. And so this data, this is in some ways new for us. And remember, we built a culture around what we thought mattered, okay? So people who were technically really gifted were absolutely so valued, even if they had massive deficiencies in interpersonal communication skills, okay? Now, I don't want to, remember, it's not either or. It's not like, oh, don't worry, you can't really tie a knot, but you're so nice to people. No, you better be proficient and expert at your technical and cognitive skills. That absolutely is required, and these other skills actually matter as well. And again, it's certainly not binary. Okay. This was a study that Jody did looking at various teams that did total knee replacement across the country. And again, you can see the ones that had higher levels of relational coordination actually had better outcomes for patients. It's just pretty impressive stuff. So I think that what we need in any system, and I'm not saying there's one model to do this in terms of professionalism and respect. We need a place where people can, if they are experienced, and I don't mean like one day someone rolls their eyes, like, you know what, seriously, I know I roll my eyes sometimes, if not outwardly, definitely inwardly, okay? What I'm talking about is when there's a pattern of behavior. That needs to be dealt with, and in a hierarchical environment, the people who are experiencing pattern of unprofessional behavior or disrespectful behavior are often not in a position to address it directly with that person. If they are, I teach more about giving feedback and difficult conversations than I do anything else. I am all for direct feedback, and I'm also very, very cognizant of, in our hierarchical culture, which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with a hierarchy, especially if you're at the top of it. I love a good hierarchy right now. I'm thrilled with it. The problem is it's a hierarchy of responsibility. It is not a hierarchy of respect. That person who is cleaning the floor in our OR, right, deserves the same level of respect that I do, because she has a job to do. I have a job to do. We should both be respectful of what we do, okay? So this thing of like, well, I'm not going to give up my, power. Like, hey, I don't want to give up mine either. You don't have to. But I need to be respectful to everybody. So that said, we're not going to do away with the hierarchy. There's nothing wrong with it. But we need to understand it when we are trying to deal with the professionalism issue, that people are not safe necessarily to bring this to the person's attention. So we need a system where people can discuss their concerns with someone who can do something about that or help coach them to do something. So now I'm going to pause and go on to what I think is an even more important part of this, and that is this. No matter who we are, every one of us, if we're not involved in an adverse event, which is defined as something that, an outcome to a patient that is not the result of their disease, it's a result somehow of our care. Some adverse events are also a result of an error in our care. We're all going to face that at some point, and if not that, we're going to face some emotionally charged, stressful events, even if there was no error, okay? And my question is rhetorical. Are we really going to talk about well-being if we're not supporting each other at these most horrific moments in our careers, which each one of us at some point will face? And I think the answer is we can't, this is so important and foundational. So what do people feel after an adverse event, especially if they think they've made an error? They might feel first sad, then many of us feel shame. Shame is really uncomfortable. Shame is saying, I feel terrible that this happened, right? And it happened because I'm not worthy. I'm not a good enough physician. I'm a bad resident. I'm not a good enough pharmacist. I shouldn't be doing this anymore. And shame is very deep, very, very negative. And I was thinking, like, why are we so ashamed after the adverse events? And there's a lot of reasons, and I think this is a good one, and that is the Helmreich looking at the similarity between aviation and medicine, that both cultures stress a need for perfection and a deep perception of personal vulnerability. And those of us who work in safety, we have bad news. You cannot eliminate human error from any enterprise. Now, does that mean we should be like, saying to patients, hey, you pays your money, you takes your chances, you come in the hospital, we might kill you, it's not our fault, we're human. No, it's our obligation, okay, to make sure we don't harm patients, but it won't come from wringing error-free from each of us individually. Because we're human, we will make errors. What we need to do is personally do everything we can to decrease the chance of making errors. How do we do that? We study, we get help when we need it, we come in well rested, we behave in a way that lets people know that they can ask us questions and we can ask questions, okay? We do all those things, and the system sets us up to do those things so that it doesn't make us exhausted, because it goes against, that's going to increase error rate. And then we also need to set the system up so if I make an error, it doesn't reach the patient, okay? But that is so radically different from the way I was taught, which is you're supposed to be error-free. Because if you make an error, it means you're defective, okay? You're defective. There's something wrong with you. And actually, it means you're human. It doesn't mean you don't have accountability for it. But let's looking at it, try to prevent it from happening next time. It will never be by just yelling at you because you made the error, which that's how we trained. Well, if I yell at her, she'll never make the mistake again. Problem solved. Okay, doesn't work. Okay, so we also have this culture, and I think physicians in particular, of value, putting your head down and getting your job done, right? And when you see things that are distressing, it shouldn't hurt you. It shouldn't be distressing. It's part of your job. You should be able to take it, okay? And also, we're so in a position usually of fixing people's problems now in these very rare for us individually as clinicians, but not uncommon. We're in a position of we've broken something for a patient. So lots of studies on the negative impact, and this happens to be on physicians after making an error. And what's so fascinating about this is it's worse if it's a serious error, but even if it's a near miss, there are some really negative consequences because we care so much and we go over and over events in our mind, as we should. It can have this incredibly negative fallout, sometimes literally for our entire careers, okay? As I said, if you have made a medical error, you're more likely to be burnt out and vice versa. It's a vicious cycle. So that's another consequence of errors. If you've made a medical error, you're a physician, your chance of suicidal ideation increases. Again, just like professionalism issues and respect are not the only driver of suicide, neither are errors, but they're both risk factors. And don't you think we should be paying attention to what is putting our own colleagues at risk for dying? I think so. The other thing is, did you guys send out the memo that we're done with shame and blame? No, there was no memo, right? Okay, we're supposed to be done with shame and blame. We're supposed to be, now we're in a safety culture. We call it just culture or safety culture. But we're not there yet, okay? We're not there yet. And actually there's some data showing that we punish each other. We treat each other with shame and blame. So there's data showing that when a woman surgeon's patient dies, that her referral rate from colleagues decreases 54%. The referral rate to male physicians when their patients die, negligible decrease. Now that's unconscious bias. Nobody's saying, I think I'm going to really, do. No, but it just shows that as colleagues, we punish each other after events, right? And even if we didn't, the system, what is the system? It's litigation. That is total shame and blame. They're not saying, oh yeah, it's a systems issue, we really want to work towards fixing it. No, it's like, you're sued, I'm sued. Now the good news is, by the way, we're working towards, and I don't know if any of your institutions is working on this, but many of us are going to a communication resolution model, which is trying to keep it out of the courts because the courts don't serve patients and families well, and they certainly don't serve us well. And there is a whole other way to do it, and it's been looked at and studied, and it happens to be better for patients, families, and for clinicians, and it happens to save money. That's not the reason to do it. But it's the reason is what I said the first part. So the good news is we're changing sort of the societal or the external shame and blame gradually, and we need to change the internal one too. And we need to help each other forgive ourselves and help us forgive each other. But all these emotions can result in feeling extremely isolated. And again, back to our being human, we are very social animals, and being isolated causes acute and chronic stress. So now this bad thing has happened, and we're maybe feeling any combination of those things, not lockstep in different times. It's very individual, but these are very common feelings, and we're feeling alone. And that puts us at high risk for bad consequences, some of which I showed you. So I was involved in a study that looked about what were the factors that actually helped physicians become resilient after trauma, the trauma being an error, okay? That's an emotional trauma, obviously. It's trauma for the patient, but we were looking at the trauma to the clinician, to the physician. And these were some of the factors, but one very prominent was talking to colleagues. So if we know that, all right, that helps resilience, why don't we provide that for physicians and other healthcare team members? We also did a study where we asked lots of questions about emotional stressful events in the past year. This was also a physician study. And then we said a particular question was this one: if you were involved in an error, where would you want to get support? And even though we have great mental health practitioners, we do, they're amazing, and wonderful employee assistance program people, after an error, physicians want to talk to a colleague, a non-mental health practitioner, because it's not a mental health issue. It's an occupational horror show, essentially, that can really be understood best by somebody who's been there, okay? That's probably why this is the case. So we need to build programs that have that available, and then there are going to be people who need things, further things like counseling, CBT, whatever it is, and that should be available as well. But the initial contact, the initial support should come from those people who the peers want it from. So we developed a peer support program that I've helped several institutions develop that's either group peer support. So if something happens in the ED, for example, it's just traumatic. I mean, it could be an error, but it could just be, a patient comes in from, motor vehicle accident, a young, otherwise healthy patient, and then just bleeds out before anybody that's traumatic at some point for some people, not everybody. So let's provide the opportunity for that team to actually debrief emotionally for what it felt like. Now, what we noticed was, and you won't be surprised, that oftentimes in the group peer support, the physician attending doesn't show his or her vulnerability. They're not saying like, I can't sleep, or I feel inadequate, or I feel like I might want to quit. Not in front of a multidisciplinary group. So we noticed that. And then we also noticed that there were some things that happened that were not at all amenable to group peer support. Like, say, for example, a nurse hooked the wrong IV up to the wrong port, right? And the person got a dose of a medication in the wrong body cavity and had a devastating outcome. That nurse is at the sharp end of an error. That's not amenable to a group emotional debrief, essentially. So we needed to do something different, and that's why we added the one-on-one peer support. So I trained about 50 non-clinician non-mental health practitioner clinician peer supporters, and we were just ready. Guess how many people reached out and said, I need help? Just put it out there. How many people do you think, like in the first year? Zero. None. I always say I felt like we were all dressed up for a party and nobody showed up. We're here. And then if you think about it, there are so many barriers to asking for help, okay? We know, and this was from a study we did, but you also know it, you didn't need my study, okay, that when something, first of all, there's so much shame after, let's say if it's an error, okay, you wish no one knew about it, you don't want to admit that it even happened. If you could hide it, you would, right? Okay, and then you're supposed to be tough, and it's hurting you. So you have to admit you're a double loser. You messed up, and it's affecting you. That's too big a barrier. Plus the stigma, the access, like I'm too busy to even get help. Do I even deserve it? I feel terrible about the patient. I don't deserve care, etc. So what we did was we changed it to a proactive reach out program. Anytime we hear of something that could be emotionally stressful, we actually reach out to the involved clinicians. We offer peer support. We don't make anybody do it, but we say, hey, I'm reaching out as a peer supporter. I heard there was an event a couple days ago, yesterday or whatever. We have a peer support program because I and every colleague I know has been in a similar type situation, and some of us find it helpful to talk to a colleague. Is that something you'd like to do? That's a lot easier to say yes to than if you're just supposed to find the number and find somebody and look it up on some kind of website that you can't remember how to get to anyway, okay? So again, is this the only way to do it? No, of course not. Absolutely not. It's just a way. We also, if you look, this is so fascinating. I actually, this is one of my favorite studies I've been a part of because I felt like it was so rich, and it also, and I wasn't the PI. It was a, mixed methods, but really concentrate on qualitative research. there were so many positive factors that improve resilience that also are the right thing to do. So it turns out if you disclose to the patient and apologize, it's the right thing to do for the patient and family. It also happens to help the clinician heal. How cool is that, right? Same thing with learning from the error and understanding how to prevent recurrences. That's what we should be doing every single time, right? There's a significant event. And then because it helps the future patients, and then it helps us heal. That's fantastic. So these are all really wonderful things to make sure we're actually doing. Building programs around making sure we're doing this. And I will say, and I don't know what your experience is here, I actually studied our hospital about 5 years ago, and we looked at every place in the hospital where events were analyzed. M&M was the most common, quality conferences, educational conferences, and we asked a ton of questions. And what we found was it was really variable whether this opportunity was being provided routinely, and by routinely I don't mean like every day, but on a weekly or monthly or even quarterly basis for people to go over the things that didn't go well so they could learn from them. It just wasn't provided. And sometimes if there was an error, it wasn't talked about, or the person who was involved in the error wasn't there, didn't have a chance to weigh in, those sorts of things. So it was extremely variable. My guess is that's probably true because each of us has grown up with a different kind of culture on event analysis. And there's some specialties that don't routinely even do this. And I'm thinking like, how's that possible? You cannot possibly improve your care if you are not analyzing your care in that way. You can't. And so we should make sure that we're providing these, or I would say as much as possible, these supports so that patients get better care and that we also recover from when they don't. And back to just the disclosure and apology. It's known, and again, this is data-based, Tom Gallagher did most of this research, that physicians are pretty bad at being compassionate and transparent after we've harmed patients. And when I heard that, this was years ago, I was thinking, of course we're terrible at it, because we're emotionally incredibly vulnerable, right? And most of us don't have a ton of experience, like, this is my 100th disclosure, I'm good with that. I really know how to apologize. No, this happens occasionally to each of us. On balance, it happens too often. But the point is, we shouldn't ask people to do something they really don't have experience doing at a time when they're the most vulnerable to all these other emotions which will prevent them from being present for patients and families. So our answer to this was communication coaching. So I coach clinicians who are going to have a conversation with patients and families after errors or after adverse events, even if there's not an error, where it's felt it's going to be somewhat difficult in some way, either for the team or for the patients and families. And I coach them, and part of that is supporting them for their emotions, but also helping them conceive of how they're going to be present for the patient and family's emotions as well. So, back to the shame and blame not working. And by the way, just let's say out loud, why doesn't shame and blame work? Because if it worked, I'd be a fan. Sure, stand up at M&M and get slayed. If it works, if it makes patients safer down the line, all right, I guess we should do it. But it doesn't. But just say out loud, why doesn't it work? Why do we need to be in a just culture? Ray, help me out here. Does it work? Yeah. People won't report. If you know that you're going to be treated poorly or your colleague is, you're not going to report an error. And we don't report enough errors. We know that. Again, this is data-based. So we need a culture where people feel safe talking about errors. That's what a just culture is, psychological safety. A safety culture doesn't, the reason to have it is to get safe care, but it's psychological safety for the people doing the work. That's what a just culture is. It's a safety culture, okay? The other reason is it doesn't give us the opportunity to look beyond personal accountability, because usually it's personal accountability and systems issues. And if you're shame and blaming, it's like, okay, she's never going to make that mistake again. That's fine. She won't, but he will down the line because you haven't changed the conditions under which that person made that decision. So I think also we should be peer supporting for adverse events, even if there's not an error, for being complained. Patients can write devastating complaints to the Board of Registration, and it's awful. I mean, the physician or other clinician has to defend themselves. We peer support for that. For anyone named in a claim in our organization gets a reach out from someone who's been through a lawsuit, okay? Just as a colleague, like, hey, I'll help you get through it emotionally. I'm not a lawyer, but, you know, been there. You know, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, okay? Chronic stress, we did a lot of peer support after we introduced EPIC 4 years ago. And, you know, so there's stressors. It's true that our program is built on event-based. It's a preventative program, so we don't wait for people after events to suffer, because some programs, peer support programs, are sort of for people who are suffering after things happen. We just, as soon as we hear about a potentially emotionally stressful event, we offer peer support in the idea that we can help people get through these normal emotions. I want to just say, feeling ashamed and wondering about your competence and feeling afraid, they're normal. We don't want to train a generation of clinicians that just doesn't care after bad things happen, right? Of course you should care, but we don't want it to last a lifetime. Or we don't want it to put you at risk for burnout or suicide or depression, okay? We want to help you through something that can be painful because you care. That's why we hurt. But if we can be there for each other, right, we're hoping to be able to improve the resilience, that is growth after trauma. Speaking of trauma, you know, we offered peer support for all of the people who took care of the Boston Marathon bombing victims, and the care was great across all the Boston hospitals, but it was traumatic for the people who did it. We did one, for example, I led a group peer support for the orthopedic residents. They wanted to do it separate from faculty. They just wanted to talk about what it felt like, and it was really moving to really listen to how they were feeling. But again, you know, because these were sort of out of the usual for people to deal with. This is what I was referring to. These are these communication resolution programs. I think they're going to be the way of the world. I'm really, we've just started ours at the Brigham 2 years ago, and it's really been amazing. It's just a different way of thinking. It's basically being rigorous about saying, knowing what we know now, is there anything we do differently, and also what would we do more of that was good? Then saying, was any of those learning points an actual error, in which case we need an apology? And then the third question, which comes from a legal standpoint, is, was the care we gave, the errors we made, was it really unreasonable? It's very rarely unreasonable outside of the standard of care type of event. It's true, it's rare. But when it is, instead of saying, we're not going to talk about it, you can sue us if you want to be financially compensated, we actually work with them and their patients' families and their lawyers to come up with some kind of financial restitution. Because remember, most cases that go to litigation, there was a great study on this by Troy Brennan, are not actually outside of the standard of care. They're essentially frivolous, right? And most violations of standard of care don't get to be in the courts. So patients who really deserve financial restitution don't get it. So this is trying to correct that. And what it also does, it's not the reason to do it, but what it also does, it prevents us from having to go through the horrific process of being in a court of law, okay? I think this is going to be the way it is. I mean, we certainly have tons of data behind it, programs, particularly in Michigan, where they started this. So I'm going to end with, I was doing some work with a hospital system in Australia, and so my husband came with me. My husband's an internist. And we went to Sydney, of course, right? It was part of, like, after we finished work. So what do we see in Sydney? What do you have to go to? Opera House. And there was a construction site just on the steps in the plaza in front of the Sydney Opera House. And there was a board of, which I'll show you, I took a picture of, for the construction team, the construction workers. And I read it, and you'll see why I took a picture of it. Our house rules: I will do everything I can to go home safe. Never forget rule number 1, respect my workmates, communicate positively with those around me, challenge my mates to do the right thing, present fit for duty and ready to do my best, never take shortcuts at the expense of safety, lead by example and be proud of my work, speak up if I see something not quite right, step up and help my workmates if I see they need help. And I thought, that's who we are. These are our role. This is who we are. Just made me, feel very good. Oh, mites? Mites, good point. Yes, I did not do the accent well at all. I should. Our daughter, one of our daughters, her boyfriend is Australian. I'm still trying to imitate him, but it's mites. Yeah, it is mites. And they also have a great sense of humor, so I like that. So I think we should honor what we have, and I know I've spent some time on looking at what we don't have yet, because I think we have to be motivated to change that. But it also involves honoring what we do have. And what you have is really beautiful. And what you're already doing, what you're doing in terms of counseling and access for care, and just by the way, walking around with Mukta before here, she's like the mayor, because she's listening to people and people gravitate to her. That kind of sense of we're part of a community here, we actually care about each other, is priceless. And I do believe it's hard to measure, right? It's really hard to measure this. I think this is where those of us in this realm are just struggling as researchers. Like, can you prove you've changed the culture? It's hard to prove, and we may not be able to measure it. I don't think we will in any kind of traditional way. We're certainly not doing an RCT going, this half of the Brigham is going to have peer support. The others, hey, you're on your own. Let's see who does better in 10 years. Like, that's not going to happen. We're going to do these interventions for everybody because we believe we have some data showing there's a reason why they might work, right? And then we'll try to see in what way are they having an impact. It's hard, but we're gonna do that. But I want to honor what you have and how much you've done already. That, by the way, many institutions aren't even close to doing. So also the fact that you have this, provider well-being group. I mean, what does that say? You've got all these really caring, smart people working on the problem. That's fantastic. So congratulations for what you have done and what you're doing going forward, and thank you for letting me be any part of that. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. I know it's 9:05. Are there any questions for Joe from the audience?
Or can I? What I was going to say is, can I ask one quick thing? So, where does this land with you? Like, what do you think about this? Are there parts of it that you're like, no, that's wrong, or that part I think that resonates? Just anybody. One thing. Where did it land? Any of it? Any of the points that I made? And we can only pick one person at a time. So just do not stop shouting.
Work across the board. It's not just for medicine.
Yeah, it's not just for medicine. Because it's about relationships, which is kind of what makes everything happen. Yeah, I think you're totally right. Thank you.
I think the biggest challenge we have here and probably nationally is that there's so many physicians who have just not bought into the problem. And they look at wellness activities as an annoyance, something to be added on to their busy schedule. And they just don't see the value in all of these efforts.
Yes, I do. I think that's true, and I think. I guess what I would say about that is that, when I was first starting some of this work, people were sort of like, you know what, this is generational. You guys just need to retire or die, and then we'll take over. I think the retire was kind of nicer to hear. And I do want to say, I do want to say that I have both a daughter who's finishing up a residency, and I have a nephew who's in med school. So I think I can appreciate the generational differences really probably more acutely than I could if I didn't have that connection. And I do think, anytime you're talking about change, and I'm sure you know the change literature. You are going to have, early adopters, and you're going to have, but you are always going to have resistors. And despite my personal, I would say, surgical instinct to go right to the resistors to start with, and be like, I want to convince you, okay? It's not known to be the best way to handle things because they just take a lot of time and energy, and resistors do come around. They come around when they start to see the benefit that their colleagues are getting from this. They start to, or maybe they have an experience where a colleague experiences something negative. And so I guess what I would say is, personally, and this, having started this work, more than 10 years ago, I'm not waiting. I'm just not waiting. Because we've got an epidemic. And I also think that people who are resisting, and this is often true in organizational change, they have some reason that they're holding on to the status quo. What's really puzzling to me is, like, why would you want to hold on to the negative stuff that we know is happening? And I can only believe it's because those people think that if you are moving a culture in a certain direction, they're going to lose something that's of value to them. So if I do get a chance, and I really do try to talk to resistors too. I don't call them like, let's have a resistor meeting today, but I find a way to, I would try to have a really honest conversation about what about this just makes you want to throw up? Why is this upsetting to you, or what are you worried about? And if you can have those conversations, often people will say, I'll tell you an early one I got was like, I think you're trying to make everybody be friends, and I need my status as a clinician, as a physician, or what have you. And that's when I came up with that. It's not about a hierarchy of responsibility. It's about a hierarchy of it's not about taking that hierarchy away. So I think if you can't have an opportunity to listen to and then address the concerns of people who for some reason I think they're just not looking at the data. I mean, it's the same reason why there are some people who don't give good medical care because they think their anecdotal, experiential thing is the right way to do it. They really think they're right. They're just wrong, okay? So I don't think I'd go in with that attitude, but I think, so I guess my answer is you don't have to convince everybody, right? You just don't. And also, if you have the time and energy and you can create a safe place to have conversations, oftentimes you can find something out that you might be able to change or get have a way in for people. But I think you're right. I like that you brought that up. I think this is a culture change, and people don't like change. But let's just start with that. As a leader, like you know the right thing, and it's like, oh my God, how am I going to get these people to hear? That's what leaders do. Is they lead change, and it's to your point, it's not easy. But thank you for raising that.
Yeah, that was a great talk.
Good.
I'm sort of a mostly retired oncologist, but I'm wondering if you've been able to incorporate hospital administration as individuals into these same discussions and concerns and considerations. Physicians have such difficulty with shame, etc., because we define ourselves as physicians. It's very hard to say, I'm not the person that I thought I was, not just a doctor. But because administrators now are such an integral part of this whole system, have they been and can they be inculcated into this new system, cultural change, on an equal playing field? There's a lot of adversarial relationship that adds to the problem.
Yeah.
And getting them to be an equal part as both as victims or as perpetrators, simultaneously may be very beneficial in helping to establish a better culture. Because that is an integral part of healthcare now, and one that's not going to go away.
Absolutely.
And so
I think it's a fabulous question, a fabulous point. It's sort of, in a way, why I started early on with that sort of values conflict thing, is I wanted to point out, it depends on the institution that I work with. There are places where there's not real trust between administration and the the healthcare team.
Like everywhere.
Like, yes, most places. Not 100%, but most places. And I have to be careful, but including mine. Okay? I mean, you know, I do have to be careful. But I want to say this, that I think, so I think you sort of answered this, which is the more that we can be having these conversations together, right, the better off we'll be. So for example, for me, when I started the center, I didn't start it without, we have different leadership now, but I had the president of the hospital, the COO, and the CMO, and I said, here's why I want to do this, and I want you to resource it, and by resource it, I mean pay me to run it, okay? And I made the case to them, this is why we need to do this. Because if we don't, it's costly in all of these domains, financially with turnover, it's retention, morale, productivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Patient experience, patient actual, you know, lawsuits, and so because I think, like, if you're going to have a conversation with people who are in administration, you need to speak their language, which is they have limited resources, and you want some resources, you got to explain why, and I think that's fair. You know, it can't be just like, wah, wah, I want it. It's going to be like, here's what's going on here. So I think having those conversations is really important, certainly around resourcing, but also when there are decisions to be made, that's what I was kind of alluding to, is they need to be taken into account, or what are the pressures and the values that the administration is holding that might be counter to the things that you're going to experience, and have a conversation about that. So I think providing the time to have those conversations on a very nitty-gritty level. When I go and I help of all the things that I do, I think externally, when I'm working with other organizations, it's usually to help them build a peer support program. I say, if you can, invite a leader to the peer support, you know, to the training, so they know, because when we do the training, we talk about the devastation of errors, so that people at the top can be like, oh my gosh, these people are so suffering after errors, et cetera. So yes, it's having conversations, and also holding the basic assumption, those administrators are not bad people. They just have a different lens. They have a different lens. Ours is different. Let's talk about that. Hey, I get why you don't want us to cancel clinics, but can you communicate that, or figure out a way that honors the fact that we only do it because X, Y, or Z? Thank you. Okay, I guess we got to go.
Adam, would you like to say anything? He's just going to say something.
Oh, yeah. That was very interesting. I think I better understand now why my dad played handball every day and took naps all the time to deal with some of this stuff. I have to admit, until this morning, I was one of those persons who, I never thought doctors made mistakes, and so I will for sure add y'all to my prayer list. This was really eye-opening. But I appreciate this entire thing. Anything to perpetuate, you know, my father's legacy. One of the big lessons that I learned from him was that not only is it normal to really love what you do and to be good at what you do, he taught me that it's really cool to do that. So this is awesome. I really appreciate y'all, you know, being here and for you to continue to do that. And that was very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and I'd like to thank the Department of Medicine, Dr. Lambiase, and the Dean's Office for their support in continuing this.
Yes, absolutely.